Again, we're talking about brushwork today, and in particular, we're going to be looking at Emile Groupet's paintings. Emile Groupet was a early to mid 20th century painter. He passed away in 1978, and painted in New England, around Gloucester area, Cape Ann area, a lot of landscapes in Vermont, and he painted primarily outside. I'm sure did some studio, but you don't hear much about his studio paintings. He was an outdoor painter long before plein air workshops and the plein air convention. He was painting outside. And he didn't work small. We think today about painting outside, work 6 by 8, 8 by 10, 9 by 12, small paintings. The smallest I ever saw of his was a 12 by 16, and that wasn't very common. Usually 16 by 20, 20 by 24, 25 by 30. That was a favorite size. And even saw some 30 by 36s, 30 by 30. So he painted large outside. And of course, we all know we don't have much time when we're outside because the light's changing. And if you're painting in Vermont in the winter, you're losing feeling in your toes and fingers. So you're not spending a lot of time with small, picky brushwork. And he developed a way of painting that was very large brushstrokes, only painting what's important. In his books, he's got 3 books out. He had 3 books out. One on color, one on painting, and one on brushwork. And they all say pretty much the same thing, a lot of overlapping, but they're really good books. They came out when I was in art school, and they were about $19 a piece, which I couldn't afford in art school. I did get one. But you can get them now if you go, if you Google them. They're about $200 a piece, which I have all 3 now. Of course, I paid a lot more than the $19 they were when they first came out. But really good books, a lot of good material in there, a good solid teaching. And one thing he mentions in his teaching is that even though he paints a certain way, his brush strokes are a definite approach for him. He doesn't expect everybody to paint that way. That just take what you can use. In other words, teaching should never interfere with your own personal development of how you paint. You just pick and choose what's going to help you and let the rest go. And that's real important because I think we think in terms of taking a workshop or taking lessons from somebody, and we think we have to paint that way. And that's not true. You want to take what's going to help you, and again, let the rest go. And he was very big on that in the books. I, of course, never took a workshop from him. But he painted large masses of dark and light. And he painted everything in terms of dark, light, and halftone. You don't see hardly any tiny value changes within these big shapes. Everything is as big and simple as possible because he's painting so large. But also, he's just trying to suggest what's important. And so we'll take a look at some of his work here. I started out with just some black and white before we get to color. I think it's a little easier to see brush strokes in black and white sometimes. Let me see here. Oh, I've got to move my phone a little bit. Here we go. Seems to be fairly well looking at the screen to make sure I'm kind of centered here. Anyway, it's a little easier sometimes to look at brushwork absent the color. Same thing with, it's better to study values sometimes without color. And we'll get to some color in a minute here. But you can see big masses here of dark and light that don't have a lot of value changes in them, small little value changes. You know, the tree here, there is some subtle value change. Some subtle value change in the shadow down here below. Some value change in the big light area, but not much. There's very little. Now there's some reflected light in the shadows here that break up the values a little bit. But everything is big masses. You can almost see a large brush filling in this dark in the shrubbery and dark in the foliage of the tree and the dark shadow on the ground. There's just no little tiny picky brush strokes. And he tries to say as much as possible with those big masses. And when you're using big brush strokes like that, you're eliminating what's not important. That's why it's important, I think, to really get used to painting with brushes that are as big as possible. And again, I'm not going to say everybody should paint with 8 or 9, size 8 or 9 brushes or 10 or 12, but as big as possible. So as you're blocking in the foliage here, you're using a brush that is big enough that you can get the shapes down there in a good, simple manner. The other thing about his paintings, you'll notice they all look like paint. None of them look like photographs. They all big, solid shapes and masses. Even a lot of real hard edges, maybe harder edges than I would leave, but it still works. He's not interested in edge control. He's interested in more suggesting the form and the light and the atmosphere. And his big thing was, as far as laying in a brush stroke, is to look twice and paint once. That you look at an area you're going to paint, and you figure out the angles and the curves of the shape, whatever it is, a house, figure, tree, and study that, and then study it some more, and then lay down one brush stroke. So you can see in his brush strokes here, we'll go to another painting, he doesn't put down a brush stroke and then go over it again and over it again. He decides, like he mentioned in his book, the angle and the shape and the form of what he's going to paint, and he puts it down. And if it's wrong, you scrape it off and put it down again, but don't keep going over the same stroke again and again. Was it somebody was saying it's like licking a cat over and over? So kind of a disgusting term, but you get the point. You just want to keep licking it over and over again, just one stroke at a time. And don't hesitate to scrape, because if you put down a brush stroke and you scrape it, the drawing is still there. The value is still there if your value is right. All you've done is gotten rid of the excess paint, and you can kind of reload your brush and try that stroke again. And you can see he's using strokes that suggest the form, like the flat strokes on the wharf here. You know, they don't go up and down because that doesn't show the form. They're flat, a little bit at an angle because they're going back. Same thing with the sails. They're vertical, so his brush strokes are vertical. The slanted rooftops here, they're just one flat brush stroke. But he resists that urge to go over it again and again, to look at it after he's put it down and try and decide to make it perfect. I mean, the drawing on this rooftop isn't even very good. The lines are kind of off. Not great drawing, but he's not after architectural rendering here, or great drawing in the sense of making things exactly like they are. His drawing is really good because it's very suggested, it's very artistic, but it's not perfect. And that really has nothing to do with good painting and good drawing. Not that you want bad perspective, but it doesn't have to be perfect. A suggested brushstroke works so much better, especially his figures, as we'll see some more. Very, very suggested. And as we zoom into them on some of them, you'll see they don't hold up as well when you zoom in, but as you pull back and you're able to see the whole painting, his brush strokes, his figures, and his shapes hold together real well. Again, loose brush strokes here, you can see them on the building. Kind of horizontal brush strokes here to suggest the sideways feel of the board, some vertical brush strokes, vertical, a little bit of slanted. You know, whatever the form is doing, that's what he's showing here. The kind of half-rounded brush stroke on the figure and the shadow. But what he's capturing here is just the essence of what's really important. And especially without the color, you can see what's really important is the value. And the looseness of the brush stroke adds to the freshness of it. In other words, again, not going over and over again, keeps it fresher looking. It also will keep his color fresher looking, as we'll see in a minute, because he doesn't go over and over the same place again. His color is a lot fresher looking. Not always real intense, because he does have some gray areas in some paintings, but they really do a good job of keeping his paint clean. And again, clean doesn't mean super intense color. It just means not muddy, not dirty. It's another black and white. Again, you can see the detail in here, kind of the focal point. And not a lot of value changes in these big shapes. Now the roof has some little value changes. He wants detail there. Some detail, I guess these are chickens, who knows. The laundry, some in the tree here. So there is some detail, but the majority of it is kept big and simple. And here too, something like this tree, I'm sure is painted on top of the White House. Whether he goes back into the White House and scrapes this area out and then lays down the dark tree, or maybe puts the dark tree in first in a smaller area, and then with kind of a rolling brush, get some of that leafy look as the shrubbery or the foliage spreads out. I think we're getting, oh, here we go. Here's color. And this is zoomed in a little bit. This was a 20 by 24, so a big painting done outside. And you might look at the figure here and think, well, I guess I just don't like that figure. But it's the way he applies the paint that makes the painting look a lot fresher. If I zoom back out, you start to see more of the whole painting and how the whole painting works together. He doesn't get caught in one area, just focusing on how to render like a figure or an umbrella. Everything has to work together as a whole because he's using big masses with big brush strokes. And the key here also is to keep your values separated. These shadows on the house here aren't real dark because it's a white house. But there is contrast between the light and the dark. And if he gets too much light into the dark, it's not going to work. And if he gets, blending the edge between the dark and the light and gets some dark in the light area, it's not going to work. So he keeps it really separate. You're blocking in one at a time, generally the shadows first and the lights. But whichever way you go, you want to keep those big dark and light shapes separate. That way your values are going to stay cleaner. I like this area back in here. Now let me just zoom in some. I'm going to be able to, this grass area. It's not a big deal, but you can see these brush strokes as they follow the shape in there. A brush stroke this way, a slanted one that way, this one coming up here. A little bit of a, that's just a real nice brush stroke there. Again, not a big deal, but how you apply the paint, and again, it's a one and done type of thing. And that doesn't mean he doesn't go back into an area and add some color, because he did go back into, let me zoom in a bit more. He went back into the shadows here underneath the roof. You can see that orange, kind of reddish orange. And with his palette, it was probably his orange and cad red deep. Started with this cooler color and added this on top. So you do go back into an area to add some broken color or reflected color. But you don't go over an area again to adjust a brush stroke. Scrape it and put it down again with a fresh load of paint. And of course, he's known for his dock scenes in the Gloucester Harbor, or his harbor scenes, but a lot of farm scenes. Again, cloudy day, not everything's bright and sunny, but you can see the brush strokes, big solid masses, 2 or 3 values down here in the bottom, 3 values or 4 values on this haystack, 3 or 4 values on the barn. Big simple strokes. Now he does add, since the barn is up close, some details of suggesting the boards. But those, that really doesn't even matter. He could have left those out and the painting would have worked just as well. There's nice color variation and a little bit of value variation in there, just like the boards on the wagon. But it's not rendering necessarily individual boards. And you can see on the, we zoom in here a little bit, big solid masses of dark, and he's got some halftone in here, and then the light and highlight on top. Let me get to another, there we go. Highlight up here and the light, halftone, and then the dark. And the brush strokes are following the form. He's pulling down and kind of slightly rounded on the haystacks. Rounded stroke on the figure here. And there's no need to render the figure perfectly. I mean, definitely no eyeballs or ears or noses. It's just a shape. Shape and a mass. Whatever you can get down with big, solid brush strokes, and eliminating what's important. And I think a big part of getting good brush strokes down is how you interpret things. In other words, if you can look at a landscape and see it in terms of big shapes, big masses, and not detail, you're going to have a lot easier time with brushwork. But if you're still at the point of focusing on detail, or you fall in love with an area and you're going to render it to death, your brush strokes are going to show that. So get in the habit, again, and that's what the smaller paintings are for, to train your eye to see things in larger masses. It's just easy to learn that on a smaller board. Then move to a bigger board and bigger brush and try and keep it that simple. But this one too, there's a lot going on, especially in the shadows. Here the shadows are big shadows. Everything's kind of backlit, so the shadows are kind of lighter. So you see a lot more color, a lot more variation in the shadow. Whereas in this one, not so much. The shadows are real dark and small. But because of the backlighting here, shadows are big, a lot more color. I don't know if you can see the color in these or not in the video. Yeah, it goes a little dark here in the what do you call that, a bow? Side of the boat. Goes really dark, kind of loses some of the color. But a lot of color in these shadows because they're bigger and lighter. So you're kind of focusing on the shadows here, and the lights are more simple. A little less color variation, and you got more variation in the shadows. But again, the brush strokes are following the form, kind of half rounded on the side of the boat. They're flat on the wharf here, rounded on the figure. So what he kind of sacrifices in terms of tighter drawing, he gains, I think, in better color, a fresher look to his painting. Because you can't have it all. You can't have a loose, fresh painting, very loose brushwork, and tight drawing. It's just not gonna work. So don't hesitate to sacrifice some things. Now, sacrificing tight drawing doesn't mean bad drawing. It's not an excuse for bad drawing, but you're sacrificing that tendency to want to render too much for the sake of big masses to suggest the light and the form. It's a real nice painting here. And I think he painted outside, just every day. Every day he was painting outside. Most of it was outside. And he cranked them out, and so I've seen some that I don't like. Whenever you paint that many paintings, you're not going to hit it every time. I don't think he was that picky. He just knocked them out. Some I would have scraped rather than put in a frame. And it could have been that just, stuck around in the studio after he passed, and they ended up in galleries. But we all have bad paintings. It's just that most of us throw them away. And of course, this is a landscape, not a harbor scene. And again, very big, solid masses. Now, the trees in here, he did break up. You can see the small little lights coming through. And we use this painting as a practice in Easel Insight as a challenge, to copy some really good paintings, and this is one of them. And suggesting the big brush strokes. Again, some smaller ones in the trees to breaks it up a little bit more. Same thing in the water here. There's a lot going on, but you can really see the direction of the brush strokes. At least I think you can. You do lose some in these shadows here. Lose some of the value changes in the color. It's way too dark on my screen. But there's a lot of brush strokes, they're flat and they're flowing. They're following the flow of the water, or following the form of the snow, or the vertical uprightness of a tree, horizontal direction of the clouds up here on top. So really looking to follow the form. And again, only painting what's necessary to show form and light. And to get the painting done in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. But his work is real impressive in person, more so than in photographs. And there was a lot of it in Chicago when I was in art school. A lot of galleries carried early American painters, early 20th century, and a lot of his work was around. And it was really breathtaking. You can see the color variation or reflected light in the sail here. It's a cool shadow, but there's a lot of orange reflected in it. Really nice passage in there. And just 3 or 4 brush strokes to suggest this figure. It's not a perfect figure, but what he loses in kind of tight drawing of a figure, he gains in showing the action of the figure and suggesting the pose, which I think is much more important than rendering ears and noses and fingers on hands and things. That simple suggestion of what the action is doing. And proportions are right. It's not that you want bad proportions. You're just not doing much more than a silhouette that shows the action. And again, the brush strokes follow the flow of the water here. And you're not going to get that real well with a lot of real thin paint. It's certainly doable. But especially in the lights, if you can get used to keeping your brush loaded. And that idea of really looking at your subject more than painting. Spend time really looking to get the value right, to get the shape right. Then when you put down the brush stroke, put it down once and leave it. Not that you can't come back and add some reflected light or broken color, but you're not going over the brush stroke again to make it look better. Also, it helps to maybe look at a brush stroke and decide, or look at an area you're going to paint and decide where the brush stroke will start and where it'll stop, like this area right here. Starting the brush stroke there, and this might be 2 or 3 brush strokes, but pulling it rounded, that half-rounded feel of the whole, then maybe another one to finish it off. And then the dark brush stroke cuts into that light. So there's not a lot of picking up the brush and putting it down. It's putting it down once and just get the shape in there. And that's what he does in the water too. He puts a big brush stroke down and just follows the flow. You might go back into it to add another color or to pull one brush stroke into another, but keep it very simple. And why this kind of looks cluttered up in here, he's eliminated so much. I mean, there's real simple values in this here. This also. It's a lot going on in this painting, so it's a very busy subject that he's really simplified a lot more than what's really there. It's a Vermont landscape, and this is kind of zoomed in. It's not the whole landscape, so we can see the brush strokes a little better. And again, you can see the rooftops. They aren't perfectly drawn. They're a little off, but that doesn't matter. What's going on here? My computer's moving on me. What matters, again, is that suggestion of the light and the shape. The fact that he doesn't use 4 lines here to outline that roof, and it has a bit too much of a slight roundedness to it. Really doesn't hurt it. It's just one stroke, and doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to suggest form and light. And the more simple it is, the fresher the brush stroke's going to be. But all this stuff, these color variation in here of just pulling one brush stroke into another in this area, very nice. Again, really planning out the brush stroke, maybe starting it here, and just pulling it here, and then another one and just pulling it. Same thing with the green, kind of a half-rounded big brush stroke. Again, very, very simple. And you can only do that when you start eliminating detail and you start simplifying your values. If you're seeing too many values, you're seeing too much detail. Simple, dark, light, and a halftone. Okay, let's go to another harbor scene. Pretty strong color. As you can see the brushwork here. If he goes over this too many times, it's going to get muddy. It's going to lose the intensity. And keeping it, I think this is one of his Florida. It just looks like Florida. It doesn't look like Massachusetts. But strong value contrast because of the strong sunlight. And he's using his brush strokes to keep those values separate. You don't want to mix up your values because then you'll lose that contrast. And when you mix up your values, you end up with more halftone. And that's what you get on a cloudy day. Cloudy day is more halftone. I usually start with halftones and then add the smaller darks and lights. But with a cloudy day, you really want to separate your big dark shapes and big light shapes. Then you come in and add a few halftones in there to break it up. And you can see his color is real strong, but only in areas. There's a lot of muted color to kind of offset that real strong color. It's that muted color that makes the color look strong. Without the grays that he has, like on the dock, some in the water, in other areas, the bright color wouldn't be as effective. It would look garish. And again, cloudy day, more halftone. Darks are smaller. They are down in here. Let me zoom in a bit on this. And you can see the brushwork really stands out. Foreground here, kind of half-rounded brush strokes. About 3 simple values in there, 3 values for the hay. Again, you can go back into a beginning area and add a different color. But you don't want to go back into a brush stroke to just fix it. Scrape it first and then try and fix it. Okay, I'm looking to see if there's any questions here. Yeah, Tosca has the right idea. We need to act like a millionaire and make a big pile of paint. Yeah, and as you apply it thicker towards the end. So as you're painting into your paint, you're gradually getting thicker. And if we think in terms of starting from dark to light, generally, darks are generally thinner, lights are thicker. So if we start with darks and we're ending up with lights, we're just going to be gradually getting thicker. And at the end is when you're coming back and maybe thickening up the lightest lights, like on the hay here, maybe some in the sky, some areas on the flat ground down in here, and building those up and getting thicker. And those are final brush strokes. Those are the lightest lights that, and the thickest areas of the painting as well. I like that figure in there. There's not much there, but it really works. It really describes what he's doing. Whatever he's doing. I'm really not sure what they're doing, but doing something with a bunch of stalks of something. Sorghum. Sorghum is what they're doing. This one I've used quite a bit in teaching because the brushwork is so good in here. Again, very simple. Houses are hard to paint. There's the architecture involved, the perspective you have to get right. You don't want your windows looking like they're slanted or falling down. Lines have to appear somewhat straight, although I don't think there's a straight line on this painting. So if everything is slightly crooked, everything looks okay. But if he has one line where he's used a ruler to draw it, it's going to ruin everything. So it doesn't have to be perfect. But you can see the thinner paint in the shadows, which he started with on the house, scrubbing that shadow area in there, and then really building up the thicker paint of the lights. If we zoom in here on one, you can see the big simple dark area here, pretty dark. But, you know, it shows the shadow. It could be the photograph too. And then the brush strokes just following that slanted hill, vertical brush strokes on the building. You know, everything is, you know, each step is just one brush stroke. If he comes back and tries to use 3 or 4 brush strokes with each step, it's just going to ruin this area. It's going to look picky and tight. So the more simple you can create it, the better. Of course, the focus then has to be, if the focus is not on detail, it has to be on value and color temperature. Because if it's not on detail, if it's not on smaller brush strokes, you have to put it somewhere. And if it's on value or composition value and color temperature, then the big simple brush strokes, no detail, really works, really, really effective. And we all have those paintings where we get lost and things aren't going well, and our default is to start putting detail in. Because we can at least do that. We can at least copy the detail. If it's not looking good, just get that tiny brush and start rendering. Now this is a really, well, what I'm saying there is that's not a solution. So it's better to scrape, keep your brush strokes big and simple, values big and simple, and just repaint. Because when you scrape, and I find blocking something in and then lightly scraping it a lot easier to go back and finish the painting than to try and paint back into thicker paint to try and fix things. Because your drawing is still there after you scraped, your values are still there, some suggestion of color is still there, but the excess paint's there, just more of the tooth of the canvas or the board is there, and it's so much easier to go back over those, especially when it's dry. If I go back over a scraped painting when it's dry, I can usually see my mistakes a lot easier, and I can repair things a lot quicker. And that's what a lot of people do that go back outside the second day to paint on a painting they've started maybe the day before. They will get it blocked in one day, scrape it, and then go back the next day and just repaint because they have the drawing down, the values down, the shapes simplified, all the decisions have been made. And it's just a matter of reapplying the paint. And you can use more direct brushwork like this. And this is a detail of a bigger painting. And you can see, you can count the brush strokes on the roof and on the sides of the barns and in the trees. There's not much there in terms of picky detail. There's nothing there that doesn't help the composition or the suggestion of light. Christine has a question. Why do shadows on yellow houses sometimes blue-violet and other times gray? Well, let's go back to that house. Now, some of that might be just the photo of the painting. Let me see here. As we look at this, a lot of it has to do with reflected light, like this orange up in here. This shadowed orange up in here is a lot warmer because of reflected light from something on the left side. These are more violet. There's no color reflecting back into the shadows. And that's the wrong painting. Same painting here. Here we go. There's a bigger version of that same painting. And yeah, over here's more violet. I've seen different, I haven't seen this painting in person, but I've seen different pictures. And some of the shadows will look more violet with some darker orange in them. And some of them, like this one, looks a bit more gray with darker orange in it. So some of that's the photograph of the painting. But the key is the value of that shadow and then the temperature. And as long as it's cooler than the light area, it's going to work. And it can also be personal preference. If you want stronger violets in there, you're going to push it more violet than gray. But some of that gray comes from the idea that you have blue-violet shadows and you have a yellow house. And then you have some of the local color yellow in the shadows, and that's going to give you a grayer shadow in places where where there's no reflected light. But you can choose to push that more blue-violet too. So it's more of a choice. The color there is always more of a choice. As long as the value and color temperature is right. And this is another close-up, really close-up of a larger painting. And this is in the book. Both of these close-ups are in the book because it's hard to find a close-up of a painting that doesn't break up too much. But, simple brush strokes, nothing is rendered. He just wants to get some cooler colors, cooler greens, cooler blues. Darks aren't nearly as dark in the background as they are. And this is background too. This is it's a small detail of a bigger painting. So there's still the foreground to come. This is kind of the foreground of the background. Then comes the middle ground and then the foreground. But again, very direct brush strokes. You can see the dark somewhat thinner, but not real thin. And just laying it in. Now he's real confident in his use of values. And that's what really helps. And you don't even have to be that confident with color. You have to be confident with your values and simplifying shapes. Because in the end, if I have a good composition and the values are good, and I can see the shapes in more simple terms, I can put the paint on with a stick. And it should work on some level. Now you want good brushwork too, but good brushwork is kind of an outgrowth of getting your composition good, your values good. When that becomes a bit more second nature, you start to develop your brush strokes. That doesn't mean you can't think about it in the meantime or work on it. Joni has a question here. Do you ever wipe out rather than scrape out? Sometimes, but wiping, if I take a paper towel, let's say I just wipe this real light rooftop off, instead of scraping, what I do is I push the paint into the texture and I don't get as much out. Scraping tends to get off a bit more paint. Now if I'm wiping off a painting period, because I'm just going to start over from ground zero with the drawing and everything, then I'll scrape and then wipe with paint thinner. But yeah, if I have a real wet painting here, I really don't want to take a paper towel and wipe. I mean, you can get a little bit of paint thinner on a paper towel and just press down hard and wipe it out. But sometimes you'll see that just fills up the tooth of the canvas, and you don't get rid of that value as much. Not that you're trying to get it all the way down to the bare canvas. You're not, but you do want it a little bit cleaner. Here's another one, real nice color in the shadows, in the reflections here. Not a real intense colored painting. Maybe in a couple of spots, like on the sunlit area of the boat, some of the reds, but more muted colors. You can see how the brush strokes follow the flow of the water, and he's brushing the pale yellow into a paler yellow, and the reflection of the boat things up here. What do you call those things? Tall boat things. You can tell I grew up near the water. Poles, and just having them flow as a brush stroke in there. And that look comes again from not picking the brush up and putting it down too many times. Put it down and create a whole brush stroke. Decide where the brush stroke will start, where it will end. Same thing on this light area here. You know, it started here and ended there, and another one, maybe 2 brush strokes there. But he didn't pick it up 4 or 5 times and put down, 4 or 5 or 6 different brush strokes. And your value will stay cleaner and more effective, and the color will stay cleaner. Now, of course, if your values are wrong to start with, it really doesn't matter if you put the brush stroke down in a big, simple brush stroke. It's not going to help if your values are off. So if you're at that point right now where you're struggling, oh, masked. Thank you, Tosca. If you're struggling with values, don't worry as much about brush strokes. I mean, you still want to keep them big and simple, but make that focus more on values, do more black and white. Or if you're struggling with color temperature, focus more on the color temperature to suggest the light, and so on. Or if you're struggling with composition, don't even worry about painting. Do more thumbnail drawings. I mean, you want to paint, but do a lot of thumbnail drawings to focus on composing. This one's real nice. This has a lot of motion, a lot of movement to it, and he's trying to show that action in the painting, and the only way to show that is with brush strokes. Again, very simple. I think I saw some pictures of this. Was a demo he did. So this was done in the studio. Obviously it wouldn't be done in a boat anyway, I don't think. But he did this in for a demonstration, and I saw kind of a step-by-step of it. Somebody had it online. And it was interesting to watch his step-by-step because, this big, simple masses. Again, starting out somewhat thinner, but separating those big shapes. And then as he moves along, he's moving out of the darks into the lights and the halftones, and the paint's getting thicker, and the brush strokes are, they're one and done. But a lot of movement and a lot of motion on this. You can almost get seasick looking at this painting. You can look inside the boat here. There's not much value change. There's 3 or 4 shadow values in there, and that's about it. There's only probably 3 real distinct shadow values in there. It's another nice one. These big, simple, this is in Vermont, big, simple shapes. There's just nothing going on in these shadows. Everything that's important is going on around in here, in the tree and the shed and the horses here. Really nice painting. But the busyness, where you are doing, smaller brush strokes, is in just one area. The snow here is put on in as few strokes as possible. The mountain is put in with as few strokes as possible. Same thing with the trees. There's not even much value variation in the trees, just simple shape. And of course, he's painting this outside, and he doesn't have time to. But not having the time keeps his painting looking a lot fresher, a lot less detail. Joni had a question. We are speaking about Group A, Emile Group A. Your Wi-Fi went out. Sorry about that. Again, this will be online if you missed some of it. So another one. This one looks a little smaller. Maybe this is a 20 by 24 or 16 by 20. But still, brush strokes are big and simple. you could thought process of starting here and just pulling the brush stroke this way in this value and pulling it that way. Just big, simple masses with as few brush strokes as possible. And again, we are showing, someone else just asked a question, we're showing Emile Groupé, early 20th century American painter. And not much detail anywhere, even the focal point, somewhere right around in here, not much detail. Some dead leaves there, but it's definitely another outdoor painting where he doesn't have time to pick around with it. Now this one is not Emile Groupé. I threw this one in because I saw it towards the end of my folders of artist work. This is Aldro Hibbard, who is somewhat of a contemporary of Emile. He's older, probably by 20, 25 years, but painted in Vermont and Cape Ann area also. But again, you can see, while there's more detail in here, it's probably a studio painting, these big brush strokes in these areas where he's really simplifying. You can see and count the brush strokes. Now there's more of them. It's more studio oriented, but you can see how much he's simplified and how the brush strokes are showing the form. So even if you're breaking your area up into more brush strokes, you're still trying to simplify. You're still trying to eliminate what's not necessary. And again, nice sense of kind of a half sunny day. Yeah, if you can find some of Emile Groupé's books, Joni found some at the library. And again, you can still buy them online. They're pretty pricey, though. You can probably buy some used ones on Amazon as well. But they're really, really good. They're written well, too. They're written and or edited by Charles Movelli, who was a really good painter, died a couple of years ago from the Gloucester area. By the way, if you're painting in acrylics, Charles Movelli was an artist that changed to acrylics, I think in the 70s or 80s. So most of the work you see now, the last 20 years before he passed, was all acrylic. And very good, really good painter. Again, primarily an outdoor painter, but some studio as well. Oh, Christine had a question about finding his demo. If you just Google his name, Emile Groupé, it's G-R-U-P-P-E, and you might, just type in whatever you want, Emile Groupé demo. I forgot where I found it. It was on a blog. If anybody knows, if you could post it, I'll look for it and see if I can post it. But what it ended up being wasn't a demo, it was stages. Think about 5 or 6 stages of a painting they showed. And there's also an interview of him by somebody, I think a couple of years or a year before he died, that's in a publication. So you can Google Groupé interview. Stapleton Kearns has a blog site that's really good, very informative. And he talks a lot about Groupé in a lot of his posts too, and I think there's several things about him in there that I think are good. He also talks a lot about John Carlson, which is very interesting. Well, that'll do it. Thanks for coming, and appreciate everybody joining in. And if you have any questions, go ahead and post them underneath the video, and we'll talk to you guys next time.